We're only 3 races into the 2023 season, Red Bull Racing are up front, and some of their competitors are already thinking about focusing on 2024. But how exactly have Red Bull found this massive advantage? And what does this advantage look like in terms of performance? There's been a lot of speculation that Red Bull's secret weapon is this huge DRS performance gain, but the data tells us a slightly different story. But if it's not the DRS Delta, then what actually is it? I'll take you through my approach to analyzing Red Bull's performance characteristics and show you exactly where they're finding their advantage, and also try to give you an understanding of how big that advantage actually is. But before we get to that, let's have a little roundup of the performance order for the first 3 events so far to set the stage. I had a chat with John and Martin on Autosport last week, and we looked at a few of these things in a little bit of detail, but spending a little bit more time thinking about it, I just wanted to deep dive a little bit further into some of these topics because we can nerd out a little bit here, right? So let's start with a quick look at the first 3 races and the team's qualifying performances. Here's the gap to pole position for the fastest drivers on each team. Red Bull have set the qualifying pace at the first 3 events so far. Now, it has to be said that both Bahrain and Jeddah were pretty straightforward events, with no big surprises in the pecking order. We're looking at Red Bull, then Ferrari, and then Aston and Mercedes, closely followed by Alpine and the rest. Yes, there is a bit of movement around the midfield, but that's not particularly surprising, especially considering we're only 3 races in, and I do expect to see a little bit of movement in the midfield through the rest of the season. Now, before we talk about the DRS power for various teams, I do want to look at Australia qualifying in particular. If you look at the changes from race 2 to race 3, it looks like Mercedes and Williams made huge gains. Meanwhile, Ferrari, Alpine, McLaren, and Alfa Romeo all fell off. But I don't think that's necessarily indicative of performance or the changes to the car, so what else was going on here? In qualifying, it was clear that everybody was struggling with warm-up. Each team seemed to have their own interpretation of the best way to bring the tires in for qualifying. We had some drivers doing an out lap, 1 build lap, then their push lap, and other drivers were doing 2 build laps, and all of them pretty much had varied results. Tire warm-up and preparation is all about generating temperature in the carcass of the tire without oversliding the tires on the surface. Now, losing free practice 2 to rain in Australia meant that the teams were on the back foot in terms of learning, and whoever adapted more quickly found more pace in qualifying. But in Melbourne, none of the teams had particularly clean sessions, with Mercedes and Williams being the only teams that improved relative to Red Bull. So Red Bull have a clear gap to the rest of the field in single lap and race pace, and a lot of the attention has been put on their blistering top speeds with the DRS activated. Is this really why they're so much faster? Most of you probably saw the lap during the Australian Grand Prix where Max overtook Lewis like he was standing still into turn 9. How are teams supposed to compete with that? And if you want to see what that looks like, you can see here in the data, Max is closing up to Lewis here. You can see Max getting a little bit of a toe from him on the straight. Then the DRS opens and the speed gain is massive for the Red Bull. I've seen some pretty crazy numbers throwing around like 30 or 40 kilometers an hour, but on the straight leading up to turn 9, Verstappen was about 20 kilometers an hour faster than Hamilton, which is not crazy for a DRS overtake. Then you can see through the rest of the lap, Hamilton backs out through turn 9, 10, and turn 11, 12 quite substantially. By the end of this lap, Verstappen is 2 seconds clear of Hamilton, and they kind of just carry on doing their own thing for the rest of the race. Now, some 40 laps later before the red flag, Verstappen has only pulled an 8-second gap to Hamilton. So there's definitely some pace management there for sure. But let's talk about why Red Bull's strength is not their DRS power. And just to be clear, the Red Bull is not 2 seconds a lap faster than Mercedes in race trim. When we talk about the DRS Delta or the DRS power, it's simply the difference in top speed of the car with DRS on versus off. We can pretty much only take these values from the race because teams don't do representative laps in qualifying with DRS off. Some of these charts I'm about to show you, I'm just going to go through them quickly. And if you want to study them a bit more, feel free to pause the video. But if you'd like a lot more of the geeky data, you should definitely check out the link to the Buy Me a Coffee in the description below. I go into a lot more detail on all this stuff every race weekend, and I even do special reports on topics such as the DRS Delta. So let's start with the Australia race DRS speeds offset. You can see here that Red Bull clearly have the largest DRS Delta at 26 kilometers an hour, with Haas in a close second. In this event, Aston Martin and Ferrari have the second and third smallest DRS deltas respectively, so between 18 and 19 kilometers an hour. And then Mercedes is sitting around 6 with 22 kilometer hour delta. So in short, the DRS delta alone is fairly misleading, and it actually doesn't tell us anything particularly useful. But to put it in context, if we go all the way back to Bahrain, yes, Red Bull had the second largest DRS delta, but in Jeddah, they had the 6th largest. So the DRS delta alone is a bit of an oversimplification, and it also varies massively from track to track. so we need to keep digging to understand where they're finding this performance. Now, one question I've always had is why does a certain team have a bigger DRS delta than another team? And it's actually a little bit more specific than that. In general, the rear wing defines the downforce and drag level of a car. The teams pick these based on the circuit's requirements and their car's characteristics. Then, teams have different solutions for making more or less downforce with the rear wing, such as the shape and geometry of the main plane, or the largest element, and then the geometry of the movable DRS flap. Now, the geometry of the rear wing is only one aspect which determines the size of your DRS delta, or the power of your DRS. There's also a beam wing, which interacts with the diffuser and the rear wing, and then there's the entire discussion of how much downforce you produce with the floor versus the other parts of the car like the wings. So there's a lot of factors involved when teams determine how big of a DRS they can have on a configuration of their car. So let's talk about what's really important, the actual top speed range of the car, not just the top speed with the DRS open. So let's have a look at the team's top speed range with DRS off and on in Australia during the race. Now this chart here shows the range of each team's DRS off speed on the lower limit to their DRS on speed on the upper limit. Now this chart is sorted by DRS off speed, and Mercedes was pretty much one of the slowest cars in a straight line, DRS on and off, other than maybe the Aston Martin. Which is pretty interesting considering both Mercedes and Aston were up there in terms of qualifying pace and obviously race pace, as both Alonso and Hamilton finished on the podium. But the way in which they're achieving this performance is just different to the Red Bull, which leads us to where the Red Bull are really making up the difference. So it's not the DRS delta or the overall top speed, so where is Red Bull making up this lap time over their competitors? And if you haven't already, now's probably a great time to click the subscribe button. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious now that Red Bull are making up the rest of their time in the corners, but I need to point out one very specific characteristic, and the best way to do that is to look at qualifying performance. Very quickly, this chart indicates the overall lap time at the top to bottom. The closer you are to the bottom, the faster your car's lap time is, and then the top speed is indicated on left to right. So with the slower top speeds on the left of the chart and the faster top speeds on the right of the chart. Now, here's a very interesting thing. Red Bull tend to sit at every event in the bottom right corner, which means their lap times are great and their top speeds are fast. So what does this say? The Red Bull have found a way not only to have excellent top speed or low drag in a straight line, but they also have excellent cornering performance or downforce. And this is something you'll hear referred to as aero efficiency or lift to drag ratio. Now there are a few possibilities here, and here's the first one. The characteristics of the car's aero design mean they found a way to shed drag when the car is in a straight line, but once the car moves into a cornering state, the downforce increases. Now that's a great aim of almost every Formula 1 car, but how you can get a car to stop producing drag and downforce in a straight line is not necessarily straightforward if you still want to keep some of that downforce in the corners. Now here's the second thing that I can think of. Possibly Red Bull have found a way to drop the rear ride height of the car in a straight line. Lowering the rear ride height of the car on the straights is usually a great way to reduce drag, but you still have to make sure that the rear ride height of the car is in the correct window through the corners in order to produce downforce through the corners. Now I haven't extensively studied all the offboard camera shots of the car, and to be fair, we're looking for something like 5 to 10 millimeters to make a reasonable difference to drag, so good luck spotting that. There's possibly something there, but we need to talk about where and how they're finding the cornering performance. The next thing I've done is gone through and characterized all the team's performance in various segments of the track by breaking them down into low speed, medium speed, and high speed corners. I'm not going to focus too much on the graphs here as they're not particularly digestible yet, but I'll have a more detailed breakdown and analysis on the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description for our members. We've had a few different stories in the first few events of where is Red Bull making up the difference, and that depends entirely on how teams are optimizing their cars for each track and the compromises they have to make. So let's start with Bahrain. Red Bull and Ferrari elected to run less downforce in order to maximize their top speed. So despite being a similar speed in all of the cornering speed ranges to Mercedes and Aston, a few kilometers an hour in the straight line was all that Red Bull and Ferrari needed to put them out front in terms of single lap pace. Obviously, Ferrari struggled in the race, which is another topic entirely, and we'll kind of touch on that in a second. Jeddah is a completely different animal altogether, and the Red Bull really shined here. Red Bull and Ferrari were actually very close in terms of cornering performance, but Red Bull had a 6 km/h top speed advantage in qualifying over the Ferrari. It's really hard to tell with the limited data that we have, but I can't help but think that Ferrari may have had to dial it back just a little bit after their engine issues in Bahrain. In Jeddah, Aston also struggled with low speed performance here, and the Mercedes struggled pretty much in all the speed ranges comparatively. And both of these teams were 10 km/h slower end of straight. So the story in Jeddah is completely different to Bahrain, and finally that brings us to Australia, which is a little bit of an odd one. Ferrari massively underperformed and were quite a bit far out of the order considering the potential of their car if we look at the data in terms of their cornering speeds. The Red Bull's high speed cornering performance was just too much for the other teams, especially considering they were fastest of the front runners in a straight line. Again, there's way too much detail to go into of all this to look at every team, but if you want to see more, check out the link in the description. So if I wanted to summarize the performance of the top 4 teams so far, I'd summarize it like this. Mercedes, I think, is clearly lacking grip in all the speed ranges, and they're about 3rd overall in terms of drag or efficiency. Then there's Aston Martin. They're similar or better cornering performance to the Mercedes, but they're the lowest in terms of efficiency or the highest drag of the top 4 teams. So they have to run a little bit more downforce in order to be competitive, but that might not be so bad. Ferrari look like they might have taken a hit in efficiency since Bahrain, but they tend to be 2nd overall in terms of top speeds, and their cornering performance is comparable to the Red Bull. And finally, there's the Red Bull. The car just kind of has everything right now. It's got high grip in all the speed ranges and then low drag in the straights. But that doesn't tell us everything. We've only really talked about qualifying performance here, and we need to answer or at least discuss one final topic. How is Red Bull pulling such a massive gap in the race despite only being a few tenths ahead in qualifying? In Bahrain, they pulled a 40-second gap by the end. In Jeddah, it was about 20 seconds, and before the red flags in Australia, it was about a 10-second gap. If you watch their onboards, the car just looks completely planted, and a stable car gives you 2 things. I always hear the discussion that high downforce is better or low downforce is better for tire deg, and in isolation, neither of these statements are strictly true. Tire wear and degradation tend to come from either overheating the tires or from sliding them excessively, or of course, both. A car which is easier to control without slipping or sliding over the limit of the tire will tend to have better tire wear. This car could have slightly higher or slightly lower downforce. The downforce isn't as big of a factor there. Now, the second thing to talk about is that if your car has a genuine pace advantage, by driving slower or managing the pace more, you can gain quite a bit on tire limited circuits, which is one of the possible explanations for Red Bull's massive advantage in both Bahrain and to a lesser extent Jeddah. Australia, on the other hand, could have very well been a 0-stop hard tire race, if that were even legal. So the Red Bull clearly have an advantage overall in terms of efficiency over the other teams. And it looks like over the last 2 years, they've just found some small improvements in several places rather than a single exploit. All of these different topics are so nuanced, and I can go on into details for ages. So if there's something you're especially curious about, be sure to leave me a suggestion below in the comments. I've left you a few more videos here that I think you'll enjoy, and be sure to check out the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description if you want some more of that nerdy data. I'll see you guys soon.